everyone, welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie. For those of you who are new to this channel, this is a channel where I read through all of the unread books on my bookshelf until we reach zero, and we are a long way from zero. Today I want to make a video about Nonfiction November, which is coming up very quickly. I don't necessarily see myself as a huge nonfiction reader, although before I make this video, I had a look through some of the books that I read in the last few years, and it seems that about somewhere between a third to a quarter of them are nonfiction books, which is actually far more than I thought. And of the books that are sitting currently unread on my bookshelf, a fair chunk of them are nonfiction books. So my goal for the month of November is to try and get through as many of them as possible. Now, in doing that, I also thought it would be fun to try and fit my reading around the prompts that are given for Nonfiction November. So for those who don't know, Nonfiction November is hosted by a book olive, and she's provided 4 words that are intentionally open to interpretation to prompt your reading for the month. And I really want to make use of those 4 words to try and direct me to certain books on my bookshelf, and to see if I can make connections that are tenuous but nonetheless justifiable based on the words. So let's have a look at the 4 words. They are fraud, web, capital, and display. So I've had a look on my bookshelf, and I have some ideas about what I want to read for each one of those prompts. I want to start with the first word, which is fraud. And this is the word that I actually struggled with the most. With the other 3 words, as soon as I saw them, I had an idea of what books on my bookshelf that might naturally fit within the prompt. The word fraud I really struggled with because I don't actually have a lot of books on my bookshelf that are sort of true crime books. And those are sort of the books that immediately came to mind. But I decided to take a step back and try and find some tenuous connections. And I thought about what the word fraud actually means. Now, in a legal sense, fraud generally means obtaining a benefit by deception. And in that sense, nothing is more fraudulent than colonialism and empire. And so I decided to pick this book, which is Empire: How Britain Made the Modern World by Niall Ferguson, as my book for fraud. So for those of you who don't know, Niall Ferguson is a conservative historian. And I stress the word conservative because one of the reasons why this book has sat on my bookshelf for, I think, almost 10 years without me ever touching it is because I disagree with almost everything that Niall Ferguson thinks. And I know that through, commentary and reading about him and by him elsewhere. But nonetheless, I don't think that disagreement with an author is a good enough reason not to read them. In fact, I would think of it as a really good reason to engage with a particular writer. I really want to avoid living in an echo chamber where everyone I read thinks the way I do, agrees with me on matters of politics and history. But so part of the reason why I've kept this book, even though I've never ever been tempted to read it, is that I know I'll get riled up by this book, and I know I disagree with Niall Ferguson on almost everything. But I also think it's important for me to read something before I walk away with a defiant view of it. And if you've never heard of this book, Empire is a book about the history of the British Empire. And as I understand, Niall Ferguson comes away with quite a rosy view of the British Empire, in the sense that I think he largely concludes that it was a relatively good thing despite some blemishes. I already have a view of the British Empire which is not so rosy, but I also think that there are a lot about the British Empire that I don't know about, and have not read much about. I tend to know the histories around kind of Australia and India, having studied about these regions and also living in Australia. But I tend not to know kind of the other parts of the British Empire and the history there as much. So I'm looking forward to reading this. And I'm also slightly, I have that kind of slight repulsion about reading it at the same time that I'm trying to overcome. So let me know if you have actually read this and what you think about it. I'm not sure how popular this book still is. And I'm not sure whether it's held up, because this was published, I think, in the early noughties. And I think the discourse around colonialism and around kind of neoliberalism has moved on a little bit since it was published. So I don't know how well it holds up still, but I'm curious enough to try and give it a go. I'm curious enough certainly to keep it on my bookshelf for the time being. The second of the 4 prompts is the word web. And when I think about the word web, I think of the web of human relations, the connections that we have to each other, and the way that we are entangled with each other. And that reminded me of the book that I have on my bookshelf, which I haven't read, which is Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow by Yuval Noah Harari. So this is Harari's second book of kind of a series, starting with Sapiens, which I actually haven't read. So I'm not really sure why I bought this book ahead of Sapiens. But nonetheless, Sapiens is not on my unread shelf, and this book is. As I understand, this is a book that looks at history at a micro level and tries to make some predictions and speculations about where it goes from here. And Harari's main premise is that up until now, mankind has been largely dealing with the big issues like famine, war, and plagues. And those 3 things have been the primary cause of death worldwide historically. And now those things are largely under control, although I think this was published before the pandemic. So I'm not really sure whether it still holds true that we have things like war and plague under control. Certainly the events of the last few years speak otherwise. But Harari asks what will be the replacement of famine and plague and war on the human agenda now that those are not the primary cause of death anymore worldwide. And I suppose the other thing that I hope to get out of this book is just the myriad of ways in which mankind might be headed for self-destruction. I don't think it'll be a very cheerful read, but I also think it'll be very, very thought-provoking. And to the extent that I might agree or disagree with this book, I think it would still be very, very valuable for me to think about these issues, particularly given I do a fair bit of teaching, but also practicing law in the area between kind of law and technology. And I really want to have a think about what is it that we can do as a society from a legal perspective to prevent the harm that can be caused by technology while taking advantage of kind of the opportunities that technologies present. So I'm really looking forward to reading this book, and I think I'll have a fascinating time with it. The third prompt is the word capital. And of the 4 prompts, this is the prompt that appealed to me the most, because it can be interpreted in so many different ways, but it also can be interpreted in so many different ways that are of interest to me. And I've taken it to mean 2 things in particular. As a lawyer, when someone says the word capital to me, the first thing that I think about is capital punishment. And this reminded me of a book that has sat for quite some time on my bookshelf unread, and that is The Tyrannicide Brief by Geoffrey Robertson. For those who don't know, Geoffrey Robertson is an Australian lawyer who practices in the UK. He's quite prominent in the areas of kind of human rights law. And he wrote this book, which is largely a work of legal history. And I'll just read you the blurb at the back. Charles I waged wars that cost 1 in 10 Englishmen their lives. But in 1649, Parliament was hard put to find a lawyer with the skill and daring to prosecute a king who was above the law. In the end, the man they briefed was the radical barrister John Cook. Cook was a plebeian, son of a poor farmer, but he had the courage to bring the king's trial to a dramatic conclusion, the English Republic. Cromwell appointed him as the reforming Chief Justice in Ireland. But in 1660, he was dragged back to the Old Bailey, tried and brutally executed. John Cook was the bravest of barristers who risked his own life to make tyranny a crime. He originated the right to silence, the cab rank rule of advocacy, the duty to act free of charge for the poor. He conducted the first trial of a head of state for waging war on his own people, a forerunner to the prosecution of Pinochet, Milosevic, and Saddam Hussein, and a lasting inspiration to the modern world. So those of you who may have watched other videos of mine will know that I am a lawyer. In fact, I'm a barrister. And one of the rules that regulate my profession in Australia that doesn't necessarily exist in every country, and certainly does not exist for solicitors, which is the other type of lawyers that we have, is what we call the cab rank rule. For those who don't know, the cab rank rule effectively means that a barrister has to take a case that comes to them in the same way that taxis at a cab rank will have to take the customer that they get if they are available and the customer is able to pay. So I don't have the ability to select clients in the way that a lot of, say, law firms full of solicitors might be able to. And part of that actually comes from the story of John Cook and the kind of centuries-long tradition within the English bar and also now the various Australian bars where we do not get the right to pick and choose our clients. We must represent whoever is hiring us in the order that they come to us. That's the cab rank principle. I'm curious about its origins. I'm curious about the barrister who prosecuted a king. And so I think this will be a really, really interesting read. It is, I had a flick through, it is quite dense in the way that it's written. So I'm a little bit kind of unsure about how fun it'll be as a read. Sometimes lawyers do not make the best writers for a reason, but I am very, very intrigued by this episode in history. So I am making this a bit of a priority for the next month to read. The other way that the word capital can be interpreted is as in capitalism, meaning resources or assets. And so that reminded me of a book on my bookshelf, which I originally purchased because I was teaching a subject at the local university about ethics and law in the digital age. And that is the book Precariat, A New Dangerous Class by Guy Standing. I mentioned before that I was using this book to teach. We had to read a fair few chapters of it to inform the premise of the subject, which is around the way that technology has really brought about a situation where there is increasingly more precarious employment. And that has caused kind of an underbelly of people who are marginalized from the huge profits that are coming out of tech, but whose lives are actually not made better by it on platforms such as Uber or Deliveroo or Menulog, where they don't have all of the benefits of traditional employment and the safety net that traditional employment provides. And so Guy Standing had written a lot on that subject, and in particular, he coined the term the precariat. I'll just read you a little bit from the blurb at the back. This book presents the precariat, an emerging class comprising the rapidly growing number of people facing lives of insecurity, moving in and out of jobs that give little meaning to their lives. Guy Standing argues that this class is producing instabilities in society. Although it would be wrong to characterize members of the precariat as victims, many are frustrated and angry. The precariat is dangerous because it is internally divided, leading to the villainization of migrants and other vulnerable groups. Lacking agency, its members may be susceptible to the siren calls of political extremism. To prevent a politics of inferno, Guy Standing argues for a politics of paradise in which redistribution and income security are reconfigured in a new kind of good society, and in which fears and aspirations of the precariat are made central to a progressive strategy. So my understanding is that Guy Standing pretty much ends up arguing for universal basic income, which I am a bit on the fence about. I'm on the fence because I don't know enough about it and I haven't thought deeply about it. So this is part of me being more informed about UBI, but it's also part of me looking at the issue of insecure employment, because I practice a little bit in employment law, and increasingly I am seeing people who are coming from situations where there are absolutely no guarantees and no safety nets attached to their employment. And I think that is a trend that has been long running, but is going to add increasingly to kind of the lack of social incohesion that we have in society today. It's an issue that is on the forefront of my mind. That's why I wanted to read this book. The final prompt is the word display. And again, this is a prompt that I struggled with a little bit. And in the end, I came up with quite a tenuous connection. So when I think about display, one of the word associations I had with it is a display album. And the word album features in one of the books I have on my bookshelf, which is The White Album by Joan Didion. And even that is a somewhat tenuous connection, because the actual book I own, which remains unread, is We Tell Ourselves Stories in Order to Live by Joan Didion. And this is an anthology of 7 of Joan Didion's books, printed in their entirety by Everyman's Library. And The White Album is the second of the 7 books that are collected here. I have actually read Slouching Towards Bethlehem, but I didn't read it in this volume, so I've counted this volume as unread on my bookshelf. I really liked Joan Didion. I really liked Slouching Towards Bethlehem, and I think it's called The Year of Magical Thinking, the book that she wrote about the time that she spent grieving for her husband and her daughter. The White Album is more in the Slouching Towards Bethlehem type essay collection. It is a collection of works, I understand, predominantly about life in California in the kind of the late 60s to early 70s. And given how much I enjoyed reading Slouching Towards Bethlehem, I'm really looking forward to reading The White Album. I particularly like reading kind of essay collections where it's a mix of memoir and criticism and journalism pieces, which most of these essays will be. So I think it'll be really good. My rule with anthologies when it comes to my unread shelf is that I tick off the book if I have read one complete work out of a collected volume. I don't mean just one essay. I mean, like, if there's 4 or 5 books collected into the one volume, I need to read at least one book out of the collected volume in order to tick off the book. I don't need to read everything within the anthology, because I think it's not the goal of these kind of collected editions for a person to read it from cover to cover necessarily. You might read one work out of it and then come back to it over time. So there you are. Those are my the books on my TBR. Given my day job and my reading speed, I don't think I'll get through all of them. I hope to get through at least 2 or 3 of them over the month of November. But in reverse chronological order, we have Joan Didion's White Album, which corresponds to the prompt of display. We have The Precariat by Guy Standing and The Tyrannicide Brief by Jeffrey Robertson, both of which I had for the word capital. We have Homo Deus for the word web. And finally, Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World by Niall Ferguson for the word fraud. Of these 5 books, I think my priority will be The Tyrannicide Brief by Jeffrey Robertson. I think it'll be a really interesting piece of legal history to get through, and I've also had it on my bookshelf for quite some time. My other priority for the month, I think, is going to be The White Album. I would really like to tick off this anthology from my unread bookshelf. And if I have a little bit of time, I might go for The Precariat as well. I suspect I'll teach the same subject again, but also it's a It's a theme that I come across in my work quite often. So I really want to think more deeply about some of the issues around precarious and insecure employment and what that means for society at large. So those are my priorities, and if I can get through those 3 books in the month of November, I'll be very happy. But if I do, then I'll make a start on either of these as well. That's all from me. Thank you so much, BookTube, and I will see you very soon.